They found her in the woods, naked, shivering, her body streaked with mud and blood that wasn't hers. The snow around her was melted in a perfect circle, as if the earth itself had recoiled from her touch. In her hands, she clutched something small, a bundle wrapped in cloth, still warm. When the sheriff pried it from her, the bundle fell open, and the thing inside was not what anyone expected. It was a baby, but the proportions were wrong. The head too large, the eyes too far apart. The skin was translucent, blue-veined, and cold as creek stone. It did not cry, it only stared. The girl's mouth moved, but no sound came. Her jaw trembled, her teeth chattered. Yet her eyes were fixed on the infant, as if bound to it. The deputy said later that she whispered something, a word or a name. But the wind swallowed it. They carried her down the mountain that night, past the hollow cabins and the broken fences that lined the dirt road. The locals stood on their porches, silent, watching her pass. No one asked what had happened. No one asked who the child's father was. In places like that, people already know. By dawn, the girl lay in a hospital bed miles away, her body still shaking though the room was warm. The nurses said her veins were collapsing, her pulse erratic. They tried to draw blood, but the color wasn't right. Too thick, too dark. When the doctor looked at it under a light, he said it shimmered like oil. He ordered the curtains closed and never spoke of it again. They buried the baby 3 days later, unbaptized, in a field with no marker. The girl survived, but she would never speak of that night. Not to the doctors, not to the police, not even to her own mother. The official report listed her as traumatized and uncooperative. But the nurses swore that sometimes, when the halls were quiet and the lights dimmed, you could hear her whispering through the door, counting, over and over, as if trying to remember something she had once been taught, but long forgotten. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The girl's name was Mary Ellen Cottrell, though in the county's oldest records, her last name appeared spelled 3 different ways. Her people had lived in those mountains since before the Civil War, never leaving, never marrying outsiders. The town nearest to her home wasn't much more than a post office, a boarded-up church, and a single gas pump that hadn't worked since 1972. Outsiders who passed through said the hills looked wrong there. Too steep, too close, as if the land itself was closing in. Locals called it the Basin. It didn't appear on modern maps, only on a few old mining surveys from the 1910s, back when coal veins still cut through the shale like black arteries. When the mines dried up, the families stayed, carving lives out of dust and silence. It was a place where names repeated like echoes: Cottrell, Hensley Rakes, Mullins, looping through birth and death records until they blurred together. By the time Mary Ellen was born in 1919, there were no doctors left in the basin. Births happened in back rooms, by lantern light, with women whose hands shook more from memory than age. Children came into the world, not crying, but coughing, as if even their lungs had inherited the dust. Many didn't live past 5. Those who did carried something in their faces. A sameness, like reflections from the same cracked mirror. Mary Ellen was different, though. Too quiet. She never played with the other children. She would sit by the creek for hours, stacking stones in perfect spirals, whispering to herself. Her mother said she sleepwalked, that she'd find her outside at night, standing barefoot in the frost, her eyes open but unseeing. When asked what she was doing, she'd murmur, "They're calling again." The preacher from the next county rode in once a month, but even he stopped visiting the Cottrell cabin after one winter sermon. He told his wife that Mary Ellen had stared at him through the whole service, her lips moving silently, like she was repeating his words before he said them. By 1937, she was 18 and already pregnant. The townsfolk whispered, but no one dared ask who the father was. In the basin, questions had a way of turning into curses. All anyone knew was that the child came too early, in the dead of January, and when it did, the midwife ran screaming into the snow. They said she never came back. The old church bell hasn't rung since. The child's name was Ruth, though the birth record, what little there was of it, listed her simply as female, white, living. She didn't cry when she was born. She only breathed, shallow and slow, as if reluctant to live at all. The midwife who delivered her, old June Rakes, had left her gloves behind that night, still stained with something she told no one about. For weeks after, she was seen sitting outside her cabin at dusk, whispering prayers into a jar and sealing it tight, like she could trap the thing she'd seen inside it. Ruth grew strangely. Too fast, then not at all. By the time she was 6, she could recite psalms she'd never been taught. By the time she was 8, her hair had turned from pale blonde to the color of rusted iron. The local children avoided her, saying she smelled like wet soil after rain, like the graves behind the church that no one tended anymore. Even her own mother began to fear her. Sometimes, late at night, Mary Ellen would wake to find Ruth sitting at the foot of her bed, eyes wide open, murmuring the same phrase again and again. Blood remembers. When she tried to ask what it meant, the girl only smiled, a small, knowing thing that didn't belong on a child's face. The animals knew before the people did. Cows birthed still calves. Chickens pecked their own eggs. The dogs refused to go near the Cottrell house. And when they finally did, one morning in early spring, they found the porch soaked in something dark that wasn't mud. Mary Ellen said she'd been cutting meat for supper, but there was no firewood stacked, no pan heating, no smell of food. Ruth spent her days by the creek now, same as her mother once had, tracing circles in the silt with her fingertips. One evening, a local schoolteacher, one of the few who dared visit the basin, followed her there, curious about the child who never spoke in class. What she saw made her drop the book she'd been carrying. Ruth was humming softly, and the stones around her were arranged in a perfect spiral, each one marked with a crude carving of a cross split down the middle. When the teacher called her name, Ruth turned her head slowly, and the reflection in the creek showed 2 faces, the girl's, and behind it, another one, older, male, watching through her. That night, Mary Ellen locked every door and window in the house. She burned her bedsheets, her photographs, her mother's Bible. But no matter how much she burned, the smell of iron stayed. Because in the basin, fire couldn't cleanse blood, and Ruth was proof of it. The spring of 1938 came late that year, and when it did, it brought fog that refused to lift. It hung low across the basin, clinging to the trees, seeping through the cracks of doors and window frames, until every breath felt heavy with damp earth. The old people said it was a sign that something buried was trying to breathe again. Mary Ellen kept Ruth inside. She'd boarded the windows, nailed shut the cellar door, and tied Bible pages above every lintel. But the girl had started waking before dawn, standing at the window and whispering toward the hills. Sometimes, when Mary Ellen caught her and asked what she was saying, Ruth would answer, "He's calling me home." No one knew who he was. A traveling doctor, sent by the county after word spread of a sick child up in the holler, arrived one afternoon in May. His name was Dr. Charles Stevens, and he'd seen his share of Appalachian sickness. rickets, fevers, deformities. But nothing prepared him for Ruth. She was small for her age, her limbs oddly proportioned, her skin almost translucent. When he examined her eyes with a lantern, he noticed the pupils were ringed with a second color, not brown, not blue. Something in between, like smoke behind glass. He asked if there was a history of illness in the family. Mary Ellen said nothing. When he pressed her, she whispered, "We keep our blood close." That night, Dr. Stevens stayed in town, sleeping fitfully in the back room of the old general store. The next morning, he returned to find the Cottrell house empty. No sign of mother or daughter. Only the sound of dripping water from the creek and the faint, acrid smell of smoke. He followed it to the old churchyard, where he found a pit, freshly dug, half filled with ashes and bone. At the edge of the pit was a small shape wrapped in a quilt, twitching. He knelt, pulled it open, and saw Ruth lying there. Eyes open, breathing shallow. Her skin was burned in patches, as if someone had tried to end what nature had refused to. Mary Ellen was nowhere to be found. Only her dress remained, hanging from the church's broken crossbeam like a warning. Dr. Stevens carried Ruth down the mountain himself, his boots slipping on the wet clay. At the hospital, he told the nurses to keep her sedated. But when they tried to draw her blood, the needle bent. When they pressed a stethoscope to her chest, the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too strong. Like two hearts beating out of sync. The doctor wrote one sentence in his notes before locking them away. This child was not born of man and woman, but of something within itself. And from that day forward, no one in the basin spoke the Cottrell name again. By 1940, the valley had become a place of whispers and shadows. Houses leaned closer to the ground, as if trying to hide from what had been born there. People stopped leaving their cabins after dark. Lanterns stayed unlit. Even the wind seemed hesitant, curling through the hollows without a sound. Ruth grew in silence, yet she carried the weight of the entire valley in her body. Both features began to sharpen, echoing faces long dead. The heavy brow of her grandfather, the sloped jaw of a great-uncle, the same hollow eyes that every Cottrell child seemed to inherit. Those who glimpsed her swore she looked older than her years, as if she had absorbed decades into a single, small frame. Mary Ellen did not leave the house for long, and when she did, neighbors watched from their doorways, unsure if they were witnessing a mother or a keeper of something unholy. They noticed the animals acting strangely. Dogs howled at the windows, cats would vanish for days, and cows refused to give milk. One farmer, brave or foolish, peered into the Cottrell yard at twilight and saw Ruth standing in the dirt circle she always made, surrounded by a ring of blackened stones, and the wind carrying faint voices that no human could mimic. Inside the cabin, Mary Ellen tried to teach Ruth what she knew of the outside world. But the girl's mind was not like other children's. She learned words too quickly, remembered things that hadn't happened in the valley for decades, and often laughed softly to herself in the middle of the night. She spoke of events as if she had witnessed them before they occurred. When Mary Ellen confronted her, the child would only smile and whisper, "Time bends here." The midwife, Cora Fugate, was long dead, but her warnings echoed through the valley. "Blood remembers," she had said, and now it seemed as if the land itself remembered too. The church, abandoned for years, still had a faint smell of incense lingering in the pews, though no candles had burned there in decades. And in the dark corners of the cabin, scratches appeared on walls, tall, thin, deliberate, as if someone or something had been measuring the height of the child. People stopped talking about Ruth openly. if the sheriff heard her name. He would glance down the dirt road, then nod quickly and walk away. Families stopped visiting. The valley seemed to fold in on itself, the air growing heavier, colder, as though some invisible presence had claimed it. Then one night, a scream cut through the fog. It came from the direction of the Cottrell cabin. No one saw who it was. No one ran. The sound was human and yet not human, a long, keening cry that made the dogs howl and the old women clutch their rosaries. When morning came, footprints led out of the cabin into the woods, small and large, intertwined as if two beings had walked together, one guiding the other. But the house itself had changed. The windows were darkened with a strange film, and the doors bore marks, deep, parallel scratches, like fingernails dragging across wood, and Ruth was gone. The valley did not forget. By the spring of 1941, rumors spread faster than the fog could roll down the hollows. Children spoke of a girl who appeared at the edge of the woods at dusk, her hair a rust, red flame against the mist, her eyes glowing faintly as she stared at anyone who passed. Farmers claimed their tools went missing, only to reappear months later, sharpened and arranged in circles in the fields. Hens stopped laying, and dogs would yelp and flee at the sight of a shadow that moved too quickly to be human. Mary Ellen never returned to the valley openly. Some said she had gone after Ruth, following her daughter into the hills, the rivers, the caves no one dared enter. Others whispered that she had died somewhere beyond the ridges. But no body was ever found, and Ruth, she became the ghost everyone felt, but no one saw clearly. A presence in the mist, a whisper in the wind, a stain of dread that clung to the very soil. The old cemetery, long neglected, bore strange signs. Stones shifted overnight, inscriptions blurred, and small graves, unmarked and shallow, were dug up and filled with earth shaped into precise spirals. Children claimed they saw a figure crouched there, hands pressed to the dirt, murmuring secrets they could not understand. By 1945, the valley had begun to die. Families left one by one, walking the dirt road out to the towns beyond, carrying what little belongings they could. Those who remained did so out of fear, or because the valley had claimed them in ways that no one outside could comprehend. The church collapsed in the winter of 1946, the wind tearing the roof from its beams and carrying it across the hollows. Doors hung open, creaking like lungs exhaling centuries of secrets. Yet Ruth persisted. She was a living map of the valley's sins. Anyone who came too close felt the pull of something unnatural, a memory buried deep in the blood. Animals would flee. Children would cry for no reason. Even the trees seemed to lean away from the cabin where she had vanished, twisting as if recoiling from an invisible weight. Then, a few years later, in the late 1940s, a researcher from a distant university arrived, a genealogist named Dr. Elizabeth Harrow. She came not for folklore, not for ghost stories, but for the study of isolated families and inherited traits. She carried notebooks, lenses, and a scientific curiosity that would prove both her gift and her curse. The locals noticed her at first but quickly ignored her. No one spoke. No one dared. She asked about the Cottrells, about Mary Ellen and Ruth, about the odd happenings in the hollows. And slowly, reluctantly, fragments began to surface. A word here, a gesture there, whispers that pieced together a story darker than anyone imagined. She found photographs. Faded. Torn, faces scratched out, bodies leaning against broken cabins, children staring at nothing. And somewhere within those images, she saw the spiral of history etched in human form. A lineage twisted on itself. A secret that had endured for generations, hiding behind smiles and silences. Dr. Harrow spent months in the valley, living in a small cabin left abandoned since the war. She kept meticulous notes, recording every story, every fragment of memory she could coax from the few remaining witnesses. Most were old, bent by decades of isolation and labor, their voices soft, trembling, as if even speaking might summon the horrors back into the room. But when she asked about Mary Ellen, about Ruth, something shifted in their eyes, a mixture of fear, shame, and a terrible understanding that they could not name aloud. The genealogical records she uncovered were unlike anything she had ever seen. Births, deaths, marriages, the same names repeated over and over, sometimes looping back within a single generation. Fathers who were uncles, mothers who were nieces, cousins who married cousins, until the lines of blood folded inward like a noose. And at the center of it all was the Cottrell family. Mary Ellen's ancestors traced back to the earliest settlers of the basin, a closed loop of blood, wealth, and secrecy. When Dr. Harrow finally obtained a DNA sample from a living descendant, a woman now in her late 60s, institutionalized for cognitive delays, the results made her pause in disbelief. The markers suggested levels of homozygosity so extreme that the only plausible explanation was parent-child interbreeding, repeated across generations. The child, Ruth, though she had long since disappeared, had carried the genetic imprint of a valley's obsession with isolation and purity. In interviews, the elders spoke indirectly, offering fragments. Mary Ellen had been warned. Her mother had warned her. But the warning was meaningless against what had already been set in motion. Ruth had been different. Her intelligence, her perception, her uncanny awareness of things no one could know. They were all written into her blood, preordained by generations of the same names being repeated over and over in a spiral that no outsider could unravel. Dr. Harrow pieced together the final image from photographs, journals, and recollections. One photograph remained. Its edges burned, the face of a man scratched out with something sharp. Behind Mary Ellen, holding Ruth, he stood. A figure whose identity had been deliberately erased. And yet the blood never lies. The DNA spoke the truth. Ruth's father was already a product of the same twisted lineage. Her mother was herself a descendant of generations bound by secrecy and incest, and the valley's silence had protected this fact for decades. When she left the basin, Dr. Harrow carried not only data, charts, and notes, but the weight of what she had uncovered. She knew that the valley itself had been complicit, a living organism of fear and secrecy, feeding on its own history, ensuring that the spiral of blood continued unbroken, and that no one outside would ever fully comprehend the cost. By the late 1950s, the valley was nearly empty. The families who had stayed for generations had scattered, leaving behind the cabins, the charred church, and the overgrown cemetery. Nature was reclaiming the land. Vines crawling through broken windows, trees cracking floors beneath them, moss covering every surface with the slow, silent patience of time. Yet the blood of the basin did not vanish. It remained in the few descendants, scattered across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, carrying in their veins the same spiraling patterns that had marked Mary Ellen and Ruth. Ruth herself was never seen again, though the stories persisted. People whispered that she wandered the hollows at night, a spectral child with knowledge beyond her years, her eyes still glowing faintly in the fog. Some swore she appeared at barns, by creeks, or at the edges of abandoned fields, always silent, always watching, as if waiting for the valley to remember what it had done. Dr. Harrow returned in the 1980s to follow up on her research. By then, the valley had changed, roads had been cut through, logging trucks tore down the hillsides, and the remnants of the cabins were either cleared or collapsing. But the records, the photographs, the old journals remained, preserved in attics, private collections, and church archives. She examined them, comparing them to DNA samples from distant descendants. Even decades later, the same genetic markers persisted, the same spirals of blood and secrecy etched into families unaware of the horrors they carried. In one small, forgotten drawer in a county office, Dr. Harrow found the photograph that had haunted her since her first visit. Mary Ellen holding Ruth, the man's face in the doorway scratched out, the child staring past her mother, eyes fixed on the camera as if trying to speak a warning. Even after 60 years, the image conveyed the same oppressive weight of the valley. A warning unheeded, a secret protected, a legacy of silence. The local archives contained little else. The birth records were incomplete, church registries had rotted, and the cemetery was overgrown with weeds. But DNA, Dr. Harrow realized, did not lie. It whispered what the townsfolk would not speak. It carried the story of a valley where isolation, fear, and power intertwined to create a spiral so tightly wound that the children born into it were trapped by the sins of their ancestors. The spiral had begun with the first settlers and ended, if it had ended at all, only with the survival of those who bore its mark. And for the descendants still alive, unknowingly carrying the same pattern, the valley had left them a gift and a curse. Proof that blood remembers, that silence can endure for generations, and that some legacies are inescapable. By the early 2000s, the valley was little more than memory, hidden beneath forests and logging scars. The cabins had collapsed, the church lay in ruins, and the cemetery was swallowed by kudzu and wild roses. Yet the blood of the basin remained alive in the few descendants scattered across the region, carrying in their veins the same spirals, the same loops, the same silent inheritance of secrecy and decay. Dr. Harrow, now retired, reflected on her work. She had catalogued every genetic anomaly, every twisted family tree, every photograph and journal she could find. She had traced the spirals of blood from Mary Ellen to Ruth, and then outward, to the descendants who would never know the story written in their own bodies. She had studied the records of infants who had perished, of children whose deformities were so severe the doctors had refused to touch them, of mothers who had whispered names into graves in the dark. And yet what haunted her most was not the genetics, it was the silence, the deliberate, collective choice of a community to shield the horrors, to protect a single man's crimes across generations. Mary Ellen's daughter, Ruth, never married, never bore children, but her DNA survived, preserved in state records, studied for years as an extreme case of multi-generational consanguinity. Her eyes, the same hollow, knowing eyes captured in the photograph decades earlier, had witnessed a legacy no one else could endure. And in those eyes, the valley's secrets lived on. Accusations made silently, warnings sent across time to anyone willing to see them. The photograph remains in a private collection, the face in the doorway still scratched out. But look closely at Mary Ellen's eyes. She is not looking at the baby. She is staring past the camera, at whoever might discover the truth. Her expression is not sadness, it is accusation, a warning from the past. She knew then what would happen, and she knew that silence was the only protection the valley could muster. Some bloodlines end in glory, others end in oblivion. This one ended in a spiral, a knot of flesh and bone so tight it strangled every generation that passed through it. The valley, the basin, exists now only in memory, in old maps, in photographs, and in the DNA that still carries its weight. The child in the photograph never knew her father, but her blood did, and now so do you. What would you do if you discovered the secret your own blood was hiding? The spiral never forgets.